Oh, hello. My name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Woe. So it is still a little bit before the end of the year, but I have officially decided to call it on my Classics Challenge for the year because I have met my goal, and there is a chance that I may improve upon my goal at this point, but I think probably not very likely. So I'm gonna go ahead and call it. If you guys will recall, at the beginning of the year, I set myself a Classics TBR of 12 books, and my goal was to read at least 6 of them. And then I had a bunch of random other books that were either classics or modern classics that I was hoping to get to that I mentioned as well. So this is me kind of touching base on where we ended up with all of that. Like I said, I have met that goal officially. So I read 6 classics and I DNF'd one. I don't think it's a permanent DNF, but you know, I don't have any imminent plans to revisit it. So I'm gonna say that I addressed, statused, dispositioned, I'm not sure exactly what the right verb here is, 7 of those 12 books. And then I also hit a couple of other classics goals that I had for the year. So I thought it would be fun for me to run through which ones I read, which ones I didn't read, and some of my plans, and just overall my thoughts about how I liked each of them. So of the 12, there were 5 that I did not get to at all, and I foresee basically probably all of these will roll over onto next year's TBR because these are all books I really want to read. So I did not read North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell, which means I cannot yet see the adaptation, which I would very much like to do. So I didn't get to that one. The one of these that I think is most likely for me to actually get to by the end of the year, if I just get in the mood, is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Bronte, but I have not as of yet read it. Again, I definitely one I very much am chomping at the bit to get to and just need to kind of carve out some time for. I did not get to Shirley by Charlotte Bronte, so that one was a miss for me. And then I landed on, based on all the comments that people had on that initial TBR, I was kind of between The Mayor of Casterbridge and Far From the Madding Crowd, and based on the comments there, everybody almost unanimously was like, girl, Far From the Madding Crowd, that's the next Hardy you should read. So this will be on my TBR for next year, my Classics TBR, but I did not get to it this year. And then I had 2 picks on my list that would be rereads from when I was a kid, and this was one of them, and I did not get to it just because it is a big hunkin' long project. I'm fairly certain that I'm going to do a read-along project for this next year, so stay tuned for that in that Classics, 12 Classics I Want to Read in 2020 video. I will confirm the details about that, but again, it will roll forward into my 2020 TBR. So those are the 5 that I just like straight up didn't get to at all. And then the one that I started reading and DNF'd, maybe not permanently, so let's just talk about it. So David Copperfield. I started listening, well, I was kind of going back and forth. I was listening to the Richard Armitage audio, and then, you know, I'd pick up and hear a little bit. I'm struggling, I don't know, guys. So like, I don't think that there's anything wrong with this book. Like, I think I can see why a lot of people point to it as a really good Dickens, actually. It's very Dickensian. It's just real long, which is you know, definitely a weakness of Dickens in terms of he definitely was getting those, I was about to say dollar bills, but it would have been pound coins, I don't know, for serialization. So his books, I do think, often tend to be longer than they need to be. So I was struggling with that piece. I do like the writing. I couldn't tell if this was just like a mood thing, that I just wasn't in the right mood to enjoy this, or if maybe I just have gotten past the point where I really like Dickens very much. I don't know. I'm a little, I don't know. This made me question my whole future with Dickens. For now, I'm definitely going to be putting this to the side because it wasn't really connecting with me, and it's such a big book that, you know, it's an investment of time and effort, and if I'm not enjoying it, I don't want to like force myself to keep going in it. So, a disappointment because I was hoping that this was going to be like one of the unread Dickens I had that I was going to really love and like have a new favorite one or whatever. And so far that's not been the case. I'm not putting this on my TBR for next year because I think I just want to give it some breathing room. I may pick it back up in the future, but for now I'm going to put this, if you watch my channel, you know, when I DNF something that I think I could like, I give it a 1, I have like a 3 strike and you're out system. So this is 1 strike, my first attempt. I will give it a 2nd and even probably a 3rd strike just because, you know, I have that audiobook and I paid money for it and I'd like to get my money out of it. So anyway, that is where we landed with David Copperfield. So this is the one that I didn't read exactly, but like I made a decision on for the immediate future. And then for the 6 that I did address from my TBR this year, the classics ones that I fully got through, there was definitely a top 3 and a bottom 3. And I didn't give any of these lower than 3.5 stars. I will say that, well, let's just start at the bottom. You know, start at the bottom, now we're here. Starting at the bottom and working our way up. My least favorite one was definitely The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo. And the only reason that I finished this was because I was hosting a read-along with it. And I still did end up giving it 3.5 stars. This is a situation where, like I was mentioning earlier, when we get into these chunkier books that require more effort, I really want to be enjoying them to continue on. Like, I'm just more prone to DNF something like this because it is an investment of my time and attention and energy in a way that, you know, getting through a disappointing, like, mystery doesn't require the same level of effort for me. So I will often continue on in a mystery knowing that I'm not going to give it more than 2 or 3 stars just because it's like, oh, this is a good way to pass some time. That's not what this kind of book is like. And the reason, so this book is just so, so many thoughts. So first of all, I read a version of this as a kid. Having reread this as an adult, had to have been the abridged version. Had to have been, because there's just so, all of the plot is like weighted into the back, which makes sense because the way Victor Hugo wrote this was very similar to kind of like a Tolkien style of writing where you kind of have it like big idea, like capital B, capital I, big idea that you were wanting to communicate in a fiction story. And you just kind of start writing it and you don't really edit. You just let it rip. You kind of just let it rip. And he was on like a very tight deadline to complete this because he like was super late in delivering it. And there was a judgment against him where like they would have been able to garnish the equivalent of like a year's wages a day, every day that the final deadline was missed. So he was like staying up super late, like cranking through. I think he was like drinking or on drugs or something to help him get through it. His wife and his best friend couldn't see him anymore, so they started having an affair with each other. Like, it was a whole thing. This was a whole process for Victor Hugo to write, is what I'm trying to get at. And the passages in this are just beautiful and it's a very philosophical novel about time and the relationship of people to a city and the buildings in that city and what it means to like communicate in different ways. Like, it's a novel of beautiful ideas. And in the back half of it, the plot really picks up. And that was when I was most enjoying it. It was when there was like actually something happening. It is filled with garbage men who don't deserve to be anywhere near Esmeralda, Quasimodo included. I would have DNF'd this just because of the effort, but I am glad, I'm ultimately glad that the read-along compelled me to finish this, because I do think that like this was an enriching read, and it's something that I am glad to have read as an adult. And I appreciated hearing other people's thoughts on it along the way. And I definitely think this was a great example of where a read along can kind of like keep you motivated to keep going. So I enjoyed the overall experience, which is why I bumped it up to a 3.5, because I look back on the experience of reading this fondly. The actual book for me is probably more like a 3-star. Like it was fine, but I don't know, it's a little all over the place, I think, as a work of fiction. But anyway, so this is definitely my least favorite of the ones I got through. Like I said, 3.5 stars still. So actually the bottom tier of these are all 3.5 stars. So, you know, wouldn't like steer someone away from it. Would not recommend as like a place to start with classics if you're new to it. Unless you are just super fond of long passages about medieval French architecture. And then maybe this is the book for you. And then my next one, I'm going to hold this up because originally I had Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh on my TBR, but really what it was that I wanted to try Evelyn Waugh this year. So when my classics book club that I was in, that I think is basically dispersed now, it's very sad. But anyway, when they picked A Handful of Dust by Evelyn Waugh, I was like, okay, perfect. This off of the TBR, I'm going to add that one in. And I've actually ended up giving it away because I took it to the used bookstore. It was a paperback copy that was nice, but wasn't something I wanted to keep in my collection long term. So A Handful of Dust, now that I'm thinking about this, maybe I should have put it as my bottom one. I have mixed feelings about it. I think that there's something wrong with it, and there's little moments of enjoyment that I definitely got from it. Looking back, I may need to bump it down to a 3-star. You know what? Let me say that Hunchback of Notre Dame goes up one. I think I'm gonna demote A Handful of Dust down to 3 stars, because now that I've got time from it, I remember very little about it other than my overall impression of Evelyn Waugh as a writer, which is that he reminds me a lot of Graham Greene, but I like what Graham Greene does a lot better. That's probably kind of my first impression of, it's got that sort of acerbic irony to it. It's meant to be very light and airy, but I think because the subject matter bummed me out so much, and this along with the next one we'll talk about, which was The Good Soldier, helped me kind of solidify that, like, I just really don't love it when the main conflict is around divorce in any kind of book, whatever the genre. It just stresses me out, not something I enjoy. And I think that reading A Handful of Dust and then The Good Soldier kind of very close to each other helped me really nail onto that. But there's something about Evelyn Waugh's writing that I didn't fully connect with the way that I was hoping to. I don't think Brideshead Revisited will be my next attempt with him. I have a ebook of Scoop by Evelyn Waugh, and that one is like a classic like parody or send up of journalism that I've often seen referenced. Like, it's a comedic novel. So I want to try something where I'm genuinely going to really like the subject matter and the humor to see if I can connect with it. So I think that will probably be my next attempt with him. A Handful of Dust was fine, but didn't make me, like, it didn't leave me like clamoring for more, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think I'm gonna bump that one back down to a 3, because now that I'm talking about this, it just hasn't aged that well in my mind. So yeah, there we go. So that one's my least favorite, then Victor Hugo, and then The Good Soldier by Ford Madox Ford. And in some ways, I guess you could say that I had sort of the opposite response to this that I did to A Handful of Dust, because while the subject matter in this one is also like infidelity and like marriage under turmoil, which is something I don't like, I really still would like to try something else from him. Like, this made me want more from him because I really liked the writing. There's a twist, I guess you could call it, in this book that I thought was really just clever, and the character work in this is great. Like, everything about this is really good. It's just the particular subject matter is a stressful reading experience for me, so it kept me from like loving it. But I gave this 3.5 stars because if it had been a different kind of central conflict, I think that this would have been maybe my favorite classic I read this year. Like, I really liked the writing and the character work in this. This was originally titled The Saddest Story Ever Told, and like, that is accurate. So like, if you're looking for a bummer of an early 20th century classic to get your teeth into, I definitely would recommend. I would recommend trying something from him. I am gonna kind of figure out what my next book from him will be, because I really like the writing in this. It's excellent and really memorable. It's a memorable book. It's a really good book. It just didn't personally connect for me the way that it would need to for me to love it. So I gave it 3.5 stars, definitely like my favorite of the lower tier ones in terms, and you know, ratings are always subjective and there's always going to have to be some skewing of like my personal enjoyment, but objectively, this is one of the best ones I read. Subjectively, it wasn't my favorite. Okay. So then moving into my top 3. So I gave all of these 4 stars, and I really enjoyed my time with all 4, or sorry, not all 4, all 3 of these. So my nonfiction classic pick of the year was A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, which is a classic essay. Maybe nonfiction isn't what people necessarily think of when they think of classics, but there, you know, it doesn't just have to be like domestic family drama or like an epic war tale or whatever to be a classic. Like, there's definitely classic works of nonfiction. Last year I read In the Praise of Famous Men by James Agee. I would think of that as a classic. Like, there's different types of classics. So I'm going to do this again next year where I pick a classic work of nonfiction to include in my list. This year was A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, and I really enjoyed this. This was a piece of classic feminist literature that I had always been meaning to get to. And since it's been Nonfiction November, this was a great excuse and time to get to it. It's Virginia Woolf's prose style, reflecting on essentially intersectional feminism vis-a-vis being a woman and your like ability to have enough money to pursue creative leisure. But it's got the classic Virginia Woolf meandering stream of consciousness prose style. So if you like that, you're gonna like this. And I did. You know, I enjoyed my little long wind up with her like on the banks of, I guess it was the Cam. I think she was in Cambridge. and then Mary Seton. Anyway, it was like a whole journey for her to really start getting into her points. But if you like that, you will like this. I really like that, so I really liked this. And I'm glad, you know, like I said, this is sort of a classic feminist work. So I'm glad to have experienced it so that I can kind of incorporate that into my understanding of the history of feminist thought. So I enjoyed this, 4 stars. And then I'm gonna tell you, I'm hard pressed to tell you which of these I enjoyed more, Northanger Abbey or Dracula. I'm gonna say that because it's Jane Austen and I just love her writing, probably that was my favorite. So we'll say that Dracula was number 2. I love this, guys. So this is a very divisive classic. When I mentioned it for the first time, I got a lot of comments saying, oh, I love it, or oh, I hate it. When I put this in my mid-month wrap-up, I also got a lot of comments saying, oh, I love it also, or oh, I really hate that one and here's why. So this is a divisive one. Not everybody's going to be into this. Here's why I had the best time reading this. Well, I did this as a read-along and discovered that Discord will be my read-along venue for the foreseeable future, because I definitely prefer doing it there. And I enjoyed reading it along with other people. But the reason that I love this is because with the perspective of time, with all of the intervening years and all of the subsequent vampire lore mythology that has built up in our culture, this is just so campy and fun. Like, there's such an ironic dissonance between this serious ass Victorian, I guess, novel, and then like your experience of all of the vampire properties that have happened in the intervening years. It's because like in the opening chapters, literally homeboy, Jonathan Harker, is going to Transylvania, and there's like all of the villagers are like spraying him in holy water and like giving him crucifixes, and they're like, what the fuck are you doing? Why are you? And he's just like, derp, 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 derp. He's got a letter that's like, XOXO, your friend Count Dracula. And it's just, as the reader today, you know why this is such a bad idea. In the moment, it was earnest. Like, people didn't necessarily, like, the beats of this book were not so expected because there wasn't, it was basically just like a very meta reading experience for me, which I enjoy. Like, I like a meta book, which is actually something we'll talk about again a couple times, definitely with Northanger Abbey, but I like that as a reader. Like, I like having an experience with the text as a text. And it wasn't something that was intended by the author, but just because of the way that, you know, the English speaking world's culture has evolved, you can't get away from it. So I just really love this. I also love the kind of, I'm normally kind of not wild about a ton of POVs, but I think in this book it really works. There's a lot of different POVs. There's a lot of different like styles of how the story is told in terms of like newspaper articles and journals and letters and like all these different kind of mediums. And I don't know, it just all comes together in a way that personally for me was very enjoyable. I can see why people wouldn't like this. Like, that's not a mystery to me, but for me, I loved just how, like, overall, it just felt like a romp. The entire time I was reading it, I was just having a good time. And poor Mina, oh, poor sweet beleaguered Mina. Anyway, I really like the characters in this, if you can't tell. I just had a great time. So I'm gonna put this as number 2, and I guess, yeah, I will keep it as number 2, even though I did have, like, a delightful time. And we will move to number 1, which, as you know, Northanger Abbey, which also has a very meta quality to it because it is a parody of the Gothic novel tradition that was really kind of like bubbled up in the 1700s. The classic example prior to something like Northanger Abbey would be The Mysteries of Udolpho, which is actually one that I want to read next year because I haven't read it yet. So it's a send up of the tropes of a Gothic romance novel from the 1700s. And I just really, it's Jane Austen maybe at her funniest. Like, this is a very funny book. It's a very meta book. She's always making asides to the reader. She's always snarking it up. And that's just something, again, like I was mentioning earlier, I enjoy. Like, I like it if it's unintentional, as in Dracula, and then if it's handled very well, which it is in this book, I very much enjoy that as like a purposeful decision from the author. So this made me laugh. Both of my 2 favorites were ones that just had a certain lightness to them, something that was just fun. It was fun to read them. And this one definitely, I feel like, had that. I do like the characters in this. I think that there's some of the least memorable characters in Austen, and I definitely would say this is my least favorite of the Austen books I have read. I would give every other book, so I've read all of them but Mansfield Park, I would give Persuasion and Sense and Sensibility a no, I would give Persuasion and Emma a 4.5, and I would give Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice a 5-star for me personally. And I gave this a 4-star. So by definition, this is my least favorite of the ones I've read. And I do, like I was saying, I do think it has something to do with the characters because I like Mr. Tilney, but pretty much all the other characters I don't think are as good as her very best characters. They're still good. They're just not as good in my opinion. Though I know some people don't like Mr. Tilney just based on my comments. My comment section, I could tell that. I liked him. This is funny. It's just enjoyable. It's a good time. I think something else I was pointing out when I was reading it was that it did strike me how similar this book is in a lot of ways to Sense and Sensibility. Not one for one in plot, though definitely some of the plot, but really in the characters, and I just prefer the characters in Sense and Sensibility leaps and bounds over anyone in this book. So it was one of her first books she wrote. She actually wrote this before Sense and Sensibility, but it was published, I think, posthumously, or right at the end of her life. And I do think that also just on a writing level, it shares with Sense and Sensibility a slightly less readable, a slightly more archaic writing style. It doesn't have, like, I think part of what's enjoyable about specifically Pride and Prejudice and Emma is that they read pretty well to a modern ear, just in the language choice. And I think that this and Sense and Sensibility, so far from what I've read, are definitely the two who read older, like an older prose style in the Austen canon. So anyway, but all that to say, I really did have a good time with this. I gave this 4 stars. Now you will notice that of everything we've talked about so far, I haven't found like a new favorite classic of the ones that were on my TBR. I will also tell you that my favorite classic I read this year was not on my TBR, it was a separate bucket. So let me run through that separate bucket really quickly because I feel like I've actually been talking for quite a while. But my favorite one was actually not on my TBR list, though I will say this was my favorite of the classics that I set myself to read for this year. So in terms of other classics that I either knew I was going to read or was hoping I was going to read, I knew that I was going to get to EM Forster's Howard's End when I set my TBR, which is why I didn't include it. I had planned to, but my Classics Book Club picked it, so I was like, okay, cool, I'll just read that as a separate one. And this is my favorite classic I read last year, or read this year, I guess still. Already in my 2020 mindset, but no. This is my favorite classic I read this year. It has a real prescience to the subject matter and the way it approaches characters and conflict building. It reads, I think this was written in probably like 1910-ish, I would guess, something like that. In terms of its thematic content, could have been written this year. Like, it's very relevant. And I don't know, it has a certain feminist sensibility to it. EM Forster was a queer man, so I think that he definitely has some really interesting critiques of gender roles, and I don't know, it was just really, really good. I very much enjoyed this. I'm going to read another one from him next year. And I really had only read A Room with a View from him before. I read that sometime in my early 20s and really liked it, but I definitely like this even better. And I'm excited to read, I would say Maurice. I've been told it's pronounced Morris. I can't do that. It just doesn't compute. So Maurice is one that I'm going to read next year, and I'm excited for it. But yeah, so this was my favorite classic I read. Wasn't technically on my TBR, though, like I said, if it hadn't been picked for my book club, I would have put it on there. Maybe my most disappointing read of the year, classics-wise, was The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, because I'd been hyping it up in my mind so much, and I didn't even put it on my TBR because I was like, it doesn't even belong on my classics TBR because I have to read this. I've been putting it off long enough. I finally got to it, and it was good. I gave it three stars. It was good. It was fine. It just wasn't nearly as good for me as The Woman in White, which is one of my all-time favorite books. This just wasn't even close to as good. And I mentioned this when I was reviewing it in my wrap-up, I think in October. I think part of the problem here is just like a certain level of, this is one of, if not the first detective stories or like mystery novels, and some of the tropes that probably were established in this just haven't aged that well if you are a big reader of mysteries, which I am. In contrast to something like A Pride and Prejudice, which is one of the foundational texts of the romance genre, it has aged well. Like, even though it set off all of these tropes, it itself still reads well, even if you've read a bunch of stories that are similar to it. And I feel, for me at least, this one wasn't like that. I know a lot of people still really love this, so, you know, not necessarily a definitive opinion there, just my take. And yeah, so this just didn't fully do it for me, which was a bummer. Not bad. Like I said, 3 stars. It wasn't like it was terrible. It was a disappointment because I had such high expectations for it. And then just two more other classics that I ended up reading this year. So I did read Jalaledin by Raffi, which was published in 1878, and it is an Armenian classic. There's a new publisher called Sophine, which is translating some Armenian classics into English for the first time in a long time, like a modern translation. And I really enjoyed this. They asked if they could send it to me, and it was unexpected. I was glad to get a different kind of classic into the mix. This is very parable-esque. And very short. It's not hard to get through. It was interesting. It was just it's set during the Russo-Turkish War, and it's essentially about the impact of that war on the Armenian population, who's kind of caught in the crosshairs. So, yeah, enjoyed this one. And then a classic of kind of like Bildungsroman type literature is I Capture the Castle. And just so you know, I define very arbitrarily, I define a traditional classic versus a modern classic as one's written before 1950 versus one's written after. There's a lot of arguments about when that cutoff should be made. I think probably the best argument is that World War I is a good cutoff, but I don't know. I just basically ended up going 1950 because it's after World War II and it's older. Like, my dad was not alive during it. That's where I kind of landed. If it was older than my dad, it's a classic. I Capture the Castle, I think, was written in the 40s. And this is sort of a coming-of-age novel. I think sometimes it gets bumped in or lumped in with YA. I wouldn't say that it is YA in any meaningful sense for a modern sensibility of what YA is. When it was written, I think probably was written for a younger audience. So I don't know. It's interesting thinking through how YA and what would read like YA has evolved over time. Anyway, side note, I really like this. The main character in this is just so charming. The writing is really strong. The plot is where this lets me down, so that's why it wasn't like a favorite, but I gave this 4 stars because the main character really was like the star of the show on this one. And then 2 other modern classics I did get to, both of which I very much enjoyed. So a nonfiction modern classic is Slouching Towards Bethlehem by Joan Didion in the Picador Modern Classics edition here. Very much enjoyed, 4 stars. I very much prefer her when she is doing journalistic writing essays versus personal essays. That is something I learned from this. But especially the opening essay in this, I really loved and was very evocative of the time, like that 60s California vibe she's writing in. So very good. And then I guess what is technically my favorite classic of any kind that I read this year was Stoner, because I gave this 4.5 stars. This is a modern classic for sure at this point, and a textbook perfect novel, like perfectly rendered the vision of the artist. So good. Very much recommend. If you like slow, character-driven fiction, like, you're not going to do a lot better than this. And then in terms of a modern classic that I put on my list to read from this Picador Modern Classic little line, I read Housekeeping by Marilynne Robinson, and along with Moonstone, probably my most disappointing read of the year. Really didn't fully love this one. I gave it 3 stars, but Gilead is very similar to the Moonstone, where The Woman in White is one of my all-time favorite books. Gilead by Marilynne Robinson is one of my all-time favorite books, and I just vastly preferred that book to this one. I can see why objectively it is a very good book. It just didn't really connect with me, but I gave it 3 stars. It was fine. Okay, so I think that will wrap up all of my classics reading for the year, of different ilks, you know, long-distant classics, modern classics, English-speaking classics, Armenian classics, French classics. This is all the classics. All the classics are wrapped up now. Like I said, there's a chance that I may read 1 or 2 more, but we're just gonna assume that I'm mostly done for the year at this point. And I'm really glad that I did this. I'm really glad that I set that TBR, because it helped me just be conscious about picking up these kinds of books, because I really like them. I've enjoyed having this back as more of a part of my reading diet. You know, the last time I was reading classics regularly was in my first job, so before I went to grad school. And I think just with grad school and then sort of detoxing my reading after grad school, I just wasn't as much in the mood for it, but I can tell you confidently that I am like fully back in the mood to it being incorporating these on a pretty regular basis into my reading. So I'm looking forward to doing that again next year. So stay tuned. At the beginning of the year, I will have my final 12 classics I want to read in 2020 list ready to rumble. I have some read-along ideas that we're going to do, etc. So anyway, I think that will do it for 2019 classics reading. Let me know what you thought of any of the books that I mentioned here. Like I said, I know that some of my opinions are a little divisive, so you're welcome to disagree. And let me know if you had any classics that you read this year, traditional classics, modern classics, whatever, that you really enjoyed. You can definitely let me know that below. So I think that will do it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below, and I think that will do it. I hope you guys are having an absolutely lovely day, and I will just talk to you soon. Bye.